Chapter 1. Warlock Killer. Dawn slowly approached. A small fire burned between a huddled group of mangled trees on the outskirts of a poultry farm village. Sitting cross-legged next to the fire, the small warlock, Katharina, scrubbed at her blood-stained sword with the corner of her cloak. Katharina's long, magenta hair floated gently in the calm morning breeze, a shimmer of red glistening through it as the sunlight graced it. She leaned back against her silver-coated unicorn mare, Spirit, growling in frustration as the purple blood refused to depart from her blade. Around her neck hung a black, scarf-like mask which she pulled on with her fingers, huffing in anger as her battle seemed to be lost. Beneath her lilac long coat, she wore a dark blue, short-sleeved shirt, the only piece of her attire the blood of the dogs from the previous night hadn't stained. The soothing sunlight caressed her bare forearms, the sleeves of her overcoat just reaching her elbows, and on her hands, she wore black, fingerless gloves. As she struggled to clean her sword, she tutted irritably and shifted around in frustration. Her waist donned a brown leather belt, its buckle a shimmering silver. Her boots were black and knee-length, a small portion of her thighs visible between her charcoal grey thigh-highs and black shorts. Attire perfect for her job title, that being a hunter, but not so perfect for the approaching cold season. With a growl of anger, she dropped her sword and let go of her cloak. She reached into the small satchel attached to the right side of her belt and pulled out the same paper she had last night. For a moment, she stared at the list that was written on it, which consisted of multiple beast contracts she had taken out. She had been crossing them off as she dealt with them, and the only remaining contract read, Werewolf, Nyagrad. As she stared at it, she sighed a deep sigh.
Just one more to go until we have enough money to get off this miserable island,
she mumbled, tucking the paper back into her satchel as she smiled up at Spirit. She then resumed cleaning her blade and sighed quietly, scrubbing at the blood-stained metal.
Black dogs, they're such filthy creatures,
she complained.
Their blood stains metal like wine-stained sheets. God damn it.
She muttered to herself as she tried to clean away the small streaks of purple blood. Spirit then grunted quietly, chewing on the glistening orange grass that surrounded them, stretching out into a vast open field not too far from the tree line. Katharina looked back at her and smiled.
You're lucky you repel all things ethos, or that stuff would have melted through you,
she said as she stroked the mare's silky white mane. But then, she looked down at her hand, staring at her pale skin.
Do you think I had ethos before I became a warlock?
She asked, glancing back at Spirit. The unicorn grunted, snorted, and shook her head.
What does it matter?
She sighed as the sun's rays pierced through the tree branches. The emerald pendant which sat around Katharina's neck glistened brightly. Her radiant, violet eyes shimmered as she looked up at the few birds flying overhead. She quickly realized that it was time for her to leave, so she slid her stained sword back into its sheath attached to her waist and stood up.
Come on, let's get your saddle back on,
she mumbled, reaching behind her to where a leather saddle had been stowed. As Katharina stood up, Spirit climbed to her hooves and stood there, waiting patiently as Katharina began to attach the saddle to her back. Katharina then mounted the unicorn and stroked her mane again. Spirit shook her head before slowly walking out of the trees and into the open field. Ahead, a huge mountain range stretched as far as the eye could see. That was where Katharina was headed. Spirit moved forward. Katharina pulled her hood over her head and reached into one of the saddlebags, pulling out a small cloth with something wrapped inside it. Slowly, she pulled away the cloth to reveal a small piece of bread. She grimaced as she brought the bread to her face, sniffing it.
Ugh, human food is awful,
she mumbled.
But I guess it's better than what other warlocks consume,
she sighed. She then smiled and leaned to the side so that she could see Spirit's face.
You're lucky you don't have to eat it,
she smirked as the unicorn looked back at her. But then she frowned.
You're lucky in so many ways,
she pouted. Stubbornly eating the bread in small bites, she stared ahead as Spirit made her way through the valley.
Before the war, humans were Alvengard's main inhabitants. Half the population was lost in a century-long battle that left the land scarred. Now, the war-torn world was scorned, desolate, and dangerous. However, the lack of humans had given the rest of the world's inhabitants a chance to thrive. Ethos, a divine, invisible power believed to hold everything and everyone together. Some referred to it as magic, and others as the root to all evil. Despite it existing everywhere in Alvengard, very few had access to it. Only those most willing were able to command and control it. Many of those that possessed ethos gained it through lineage, others had learned through time and dedication, and some had stolen it. A thirst for ethos sent people in search of beasts that possessed it, a search that had very nearly brought many creatures to near extinction. But as the number of humans declined, those of the creatures they hunted began to replenish. If it wasn't for the Warlocks, it might have been said that the war had restored the world's balance.
Katharina stared at a pair of Arietto ahead. Beautiful gold-furred deer-like creatures with 3 sets of antlers so tall it was surprising that they could stand up. They both lifted their heads from the grass and stared at Katharina with their glimmering blue eyes, flower-sprouting moss dangling from their black antlers. Their tails were long like a cat, small tufts of orange fur attached to the ends. Their elegant coats shimmered a dazzling gold as the sunlight met with them, but as Katharina continued forward, they retreated into the small group of trees ahead. Once she was done eating half of the bread, Katharina pulled her mask over her face and returned the wrapped bread to the saddlebag. She then reached into her satchel, pulling out the small piece of paper again.
Okay, so we dealt with the black dogs last night. The money I got for that can get me a few more supplies. I need to get you some new reins, too,
she said, looking down at Spirit, who grunted quietly as they entered the small collection of trees the Arietto had retreated into.
Looks like our next contract is a werewolf,
she mumbled.
Someplace called Neograd. It should be at the end of this valley. That old man back in the last village better have been right. It's getting cold and I'm gonna need some new clothes soon. The pay for this werewolf could give me everything I need and finally get me off this continent.
As she spoke, Spirit looked back at her and whinnied. Katharina smiled.
Don't worry, you're coming with me,
she assured, putting the paper back into her satchel.
We can hire a ship, or at least buy our way onto a trading ship going anywhere away from here.
She then pulled out a navy blue journal, a sullen look appearing on her face as she stared down at it. She frowned despondently and looked down at Spirit.
Do you think he'll find us before we go?
She asked, looking down at the book.
Maybe I should wait a little.
Spirit grunted irritably, shaking her head. Sighing sadly, Katharina tucked the journal back into her satchel and sunk into a hopeless slouch.
You're right. He's not coming back. It's been 2 years already.
The unicorn grunted again.
Don't say that,
she grumbled, pouting. But as she caught sight of a lichen fiend, a creature almost identical to a tree, she gripped Spirit's reins tightly.
Come on, let's just get to the city,
she mumbled, passing the boulder the creature was hiding behind, watching her with its snake-like eyes, gripping the boulder with the twisted, rope-like arms it had attached to its tree-trunk body. Soon they emerged from the trees and reached a rocky pathway that led up to a mountainside. Katharina guided Spirit, who began to walk up the path, coming out onto a narrow cliff edge. As they walked, Katharina looked down at the ground below, searching for anything of interest such as water and plants that contained ethos. But there was nothing of interest in this valley to her knowledge, She was just passing through, but she thought she'd look anyway. However, as her eyes scoured the ground below, they fixed themselves upon something menacing. A group of 5 men. At least that's what it looked like from where she was. She needed to get a closer look.
Slow, Spirit.
She instructed, pulling on her unicorn's reins. The unicorn slowed and stopped as Katharina swiftly unmounted her and carefully hurried over to the edge of the cliff. She peered over the edge, crouching, remaining hidden. She was right. Below, 5 human-like figures were standing beside a lake in the open valley. They wore dark robes similar to her own and were laughing maniacally as one of them mercilessly slit the throat of another with a shimmering steel dagger. As the victim's body hit the floor, the remaining men held their hands over the body, inhaling breaths of satisfaction as golden wisps of smoke seeped from the dead man's body and soaked up into their extended palms. Spectating, Katharina scowled irritably.
Warlocks,
she muttered. She discreetly moved closer, getting a better look at the warlocks. The first one to catch her eye was the blue-skinned Kayamar, a common species of elf which possessed yellow sclera in their eyes and long, pointed ears. Usually, their irises were striking colors. However, this one had been turned into a warlock, so his irises were a dull gold, just like that of any other standard warlock. He sheathed his blood-covered dagger, grinning as the wisps of gold smoke were absorbed into his hands. The second was a small, bald man with a single sharp tooth which bent out of his mouth and over his lip. His skin was paler than the rest, his head so hairless that it reflected the sunlight like water. The third was dark-skinned, his waist-length dreadlocks black with a hint of red. Around his head, he wore a crimson bandana, a sly grin on his face as he, too, absorbed the wisps into his hands. The last was wearing a farmer's hat, which he had likely stolen from the man they had just killed. Their victim was dressed in the same torn, dirtied scraps all farmers wore, and his goat wasn't too far off in the distance, standing tied to a post beside the lake along with a bucket and fishing net. As she took her eyes off the goat, Katharina continued to examine each warlock.
4. 3 basic class, 1 master. The victim is a lepus.
She deducted, noticing the dead man's rabbit-like ears atop his head. She then turned her focus back to the warlocks.
I should take out the master first, go straight for the kill spot. They're distracted, feeding on the stupid lepus, so this should be easy. As the basic ones become distracted, I should use a telekinetic blast to stun them. Basic telekinesis powers are no threat to me, but I should watch for their blades.
She muttered to herself as she looked at each of them. She was set with her plan.